Every time you click on an opening video like this one, you always expect to see the same 20 opening principles you always hear about. Control the center, develop your pieces, and so on. But instead of pouring a bucket of water in the ocean, today we're going to be looking at some more advanced tips that you can add to your game. In today's video, we're not going to be looking at a single opening principle, but I am going to be going through some things that you can be doing to improve your openings at the advanced level. If you're still a little bit confused, I encourage you to stay until the end of the video. These are all things that I wish myself I had known a lot sooner than I did, and it's how I got to where I am today. So let's start with tip number 1. Systematic setups won't win you games in the opening. Systematic openings will rarely give you a crushing advantage going into the middle game. Of course, at the lower levels, if your opponent chooses to take an exotic approach against your systematic setup, they're going to blunder more because of the complexities. However, if you're the same strength as your opponent, it's only beneficial to you if you can identify why it was a mistake. Dynamic, non-systematic openings will lead to more deliberate advantages that you can get over and over. For example, this position in the Scotch Gambit has a clear and obvious way to win if your opponent doesn't know the theory. If they try to hold on to this pawn, we can sacrifice our bishop and win it back with interest. Take note that this is not a trick. Tricks are when you sacrifice some of your advantage on the off chance your opponent will fall for your trick. This is a trap, and even if black doesn't fall for it, you're still completely fine and haven't made any concessions. Systematic openings do not share this same characteristic. The definition of a systematic opening is something that you can play adequately against anything. This means that you're very rarely following the top engine moves in your opening, leading to much more accidental advantages rather than deliberate ones. Of course, accidental advantages, or your opponent blundering, are a lot harder to identify than things that you've manufactured purposely. Decimal point advantages are important. If you're a little bit more advanced and you're beginning or have already set up your repertoire, it's extremely important to respect decimal point advantages out of the opening. You probably see it all the time. One move out of the opening gives you a plus 0.3 advantage, whilst another one gives you a negative 0.1. Sometimes it can feel like this doesn't matter at all. It's not even a half pawn's advantage. I'm here to tell you that it's very important. Whilst the 0.4 advantage absolutely does not matter at the amateur level in, let's say, the middle game or the end game, it certainly does in the opening. The reason it's not a problem in the end game is because there's probably too few pieces on the board to actually prove that advantage. Of course, with perfect play, that 0.4 advantage in the opening would not matter, but it's a burden your opponent will have to carry for a lot longer if you can gain it in the opening as opposed to the end game. In saying this, there are also times where you might want to opt for a slightly less advantageous line in your repertoire. For example, the top engine move might be extremely sharp and difficult to play, whilst a slightly less advantageous move might lead to more comfortable positions. On the flip side, sometimes the engine will tell you the top engine move is one thing, but it leads directly into some very easy drawish lines for your opponents. The main point is, don't fall for the misconception that decimal point advantages mean nothing in chess. Especially out of the opening, understanding why the engine thinks there are slight differences between moves is what makes a great chess player. Study bad theory. A terrible mistake a lot of chess players make is only studying the main lines of their opening and not studying the blunders. For example, let's say we're playing the Queen's Gambit declined Austrian variation. d4, d5, c4, and c5. After c takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, c takes d4, and knight b5, we need to play knight a6 to prevent knight c7 check from forking our queen and rook. Of course, we forfeit the pawn in the center with this move, but if white takes it now, it's actually a mistake. Knight takes d4 is a completely natural move to make, especially for someone who hasn't studied the theory. The reality is, the pawn is not going anywhere on d4. After knight f3, we cannot hold on to the pawn, so there's no reason for white to capture immediately. But we shouldn't assume everyone will know the best theory and not bother to learn why knight takes d4 is bad. It's unclear why knight takes d4 is bad, so let's understand why. After knight takes d4, we play e5, taking central control and gaining a tempo on white. But a single tempo cannot be worth almost half a pawn, right? So we need to look deeper. If knight f3 counterattacking our pawn, we play knight b4, and we're already negative 1.7 on evaluation here. White is forced to play king d1 and lose castling rights, and black suddenly has a plethora of ways to continue here. But the important thing is, our advantage is now permanent as white has no castling rights. Especially in an online game, knight b4 is not a move you make immediately. You look to defend the pawn that's under attack, and even though your opponents made a mistake, you didn't study the line to understand why it was bad, and might have never gotten this advantage in the first place. Of course, you cannot magically know these common blunders that players will make, but there are two easy ways to start studying bad theory. First of all, if you ever see something in a game that you've never seen before, you should properly analyze it and understand what you could have done better. Second of all, you might be interested in this tool called the Mistakotron. It only works for Lichess players, but it essentially allows you to input some parameters to find common mistakes you play. If you sort primarily by opening and inaccuracy, you'll find a bunch of common opening mistakes you make. If you click on the board, it takes you to Lichess and allows you to analyze them. You'll notice a lot of the mistakes are from the same positions that you continually get wrong. As you can see here, there are two identical opening mistakes I have made. I should probably analyze that. I'll leave a link to this tool in the description below. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Chess has a rich history of opening theory built by some of the greatest minds in the game. Trying to invent new lines without having a proper understanding of the established theory can lead to easily avoidable mistakes. For example, the Ruy Lopez has been played for centuries because it consistently leads to rich, complex positions for both sides. If you ignore its principles to try something entirely unconventional, if your opponent knows what they're doing, you'll quickly find yourself worse. Grandmasters don't do this either. If they want to reinvent the wheel, they do it before the game starts and confers with an engine to make sure they're 100% sure that their line works. Maybe this isn't applicable advice for everyone, but I find myself in these positions that are clearly theoretical, but I see one move and wonder why it can't be played. Let's use this Sicilian position as an example. White just played the move a3, but why can't we play the thematic knight takes e4 here? It looks like we can, but let's assume we haven't studied the theory here. Of course, if knight takes e4, we discover an attack on the knight in the center of the board. But because we tried reinventing the wheel here, we missed knight d5, forcibly removing our queen from its prime position and allowing black to win our knight. This happened because we tried reinventing the wheel. We called our opponent's bluff in a position that was quite clearly theoretical. Instead, we should have sat and calculated if this idea really worked, rather than just seeing it thematically make sense and going ahead with it. In chess, standing on the shoulders of giants is not a shortcut, it's the best way to improve your openings. You 100% need to learn the classics before you start reinventing things yourself. Be versatile. Having a versatile repertoire allows you to adapt to different styles and situations. Versatility also helps you grow as a player by exposing you to a wider range of positions. There are plenty of reasons for why learning two openings for each color is going to be beneficial for your chess. Whilst in a general online pool, it might not be too helpful in terms of specifically strategizing against a certain player, but in over-the-board chess, that certainly will. If you're playing against someone that is much higher rated than you, it makes a lot more sense to go for a much more simple opening rather than a really theoretical one. For example, it would make a lot more sense to go for the Caro-Kann as opposed to the Sicilian defense. You're never going to know better opening theory than someone a lot higher rated than you, so you may as well go for something less theoretical where you can get good winning chances out of the opening. In terms of rematches in online games, knowing multiple openings is certainly beneficial because you can try something different against your opponent if your first opening didn't really work out as you thought it would. Generally, I would start by learning a secondary defense to both one e4 and one d4 with the black pieces. For example, if you usually play the French defense, maybe try out the Scandinavian defense against 1e4. If you play the Slav defense usually against 1d4, maybe try to play the Nimzo-Indian. If you usually play the Slav defense against 1d4, maybe try out the Nimzo defense. I'm not specifically recommending these openings for you, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. Even for the white pieces, you should be comfortable with more than one opening. In some cases, I would actually recommend learning the theory to some of these theoretically bad gambits that we'll talk about later on in the video. Whilst those gambits shouldn't be a mainstay in your repertoire, it's very nice to have a secret weapon in your back pocket that you can use against your opponent if you're not playing too well. Learning multiple openings also helps with various transpositions. The King's Indian defense transposes into the Benoni defense from time to time, and the Sicilian defense sometimes transposes into the Panov. Whilst you could just study those individual lines that your main repertoire transposes into, it's very beneficial for your chess overall if you just learn the entire opening. Being Being versatile isn't about learning every single opening in chess. It's about being able to adapt, being able to surprise your opponent, and being comfortable in any kind of position. Stop playing stupid gambits. Gambits can be very fun and exciting, but a lot of these gambits sacrifice way too much for no compensation. Whilst they might work against an unprepared opponent, they're absolutely never going to work against a higher rated player or somebody that knows the theory. Things like the Latvian or Anglian gambit can catch people off guard, but they fall apart so easily to accurate play. You end up down material with no compensation, and the game is just an uphill battle from there. If you're still insistent on playing gambits, you can play more sound gambits like the Smith-Morra gambits or the Scotch gambits. These openings maintain decent compensation and they don't rely on tricks. Before playing any gambit, study its main lines and ask yourself if you're happy with the position even if your opponent plays perfectly. You should also avoid gambits that don't align with your general playing style. If you're not a tactical or aggressive player, relying on gambits is extremely counterproductive, but there are some positional gambits like the Chepukitis gambits. This isn't a tactical gambit at all, it's completely positional and allows white to take over the entire center from black at the expense of just one pawn. That's not to say that you shouldn't learn gambits at all. In some cases, I actually recommend that you learn those stupid gambits that don't give you a big advantage if your opponent plays perfectly. But the problem is, if you see a gambit in a YouTube video, the likelihood is, so did your opponent and they know how to defend against it. If you're going to play one of these gambits, try and find a rare one that your opponent might not have heard of. Gambits should be tools, not crutches. Play them strategically and selectively. Do not let them define your repertoire. Practice queenless openings. Queenless openings occur much more frequently than you might think. A good example of this is in the Briar variation of the Caro-Kann. You might think that black is obviously better here. White can't castle, whilst black still has castling rights. However, if anything, white is better here. White has more central control and more development. The inability to castle is much less prevalent when the opponent has no development and no queen to punish the central king. In some cases, this king is better off central as it's more active. But this doesn't mean you shouldn't go down these queenless lines. All you need to do is practice them sufficiently. Set these kinds of positions up against the engine and try to come up with a game plan. You'll notice when you don't have a queen on the board, all of your typical opening plans go out the window and you're left wondering what you're supposed to be playing for. I think these kinds of positions are a weakness for most players. If you can make it your strength and not your weakness, you're going to win these games more often than not. Use Lichess opening specific puzzles. At a certain level, it can feel like doing puzzles absolutely does not help your chess whatsoever. You get given a random position that you'll absolutely never find yourself in and you need to find the tactic within. It's also a little bit unrealistic because you know 100% of the time that there is always going to be a tactic there, which is not the case in your regular games. Lichess offers a unique tool with opening specific puzzles that are tailored to teach you common tactical themes and strategic ideas from the opening phase of the game. For example, if you often play the Sicilian defense, Lichess will give you puzzles based on key positions that arise from the Sicilian. These puzzles can help you recognize tactical patterns that are likely to occur in Sicilian structures. Go to Lichess, select puzzles, and choose the opening category. You can filter puzzles by specific openings. Going through these puzzles until you can comfortably identify the key ideas within them is an absolute must. You can integrate this into your positional play, and these are tactics that will actually arise from the positions that you get out of your opening. This makes your opening preparation more dynamic and overall increases your tactical awareness. Know when to leave theory. Following opening theory too closely can sometimes lead to positions where you don't fully understand it and your opponent does. Knowing when to leave theory allows you to play positions that you're more comfortable in and forces your opponent to think independently. We all have examples of this in our opening repertoire. We know that a move is theoretical, but we don't actually know why we're playing it. This is because whilst you may have memorized that that is definitely the next move in your theory, you have never explored why and the concepts behind it. For example, in the Roy Lopez, some players follow mainline theory for over 15 moves. However, if you leave theory earlier with a solid sideline like the Cosio defense, you step into a less explored position whilst keeping the game dynamic. There are multiple reasons you might want to keep this in mind. Maybe some of your opening lines lead to drawish positions that you don't want to allow against this specific opponent. Maybe you think that your opponent is going to have far superior opening knowledge to you. Learning when and how to step out of theory allows you to take control of the game. You develop a deeper understanding of the positions and keep your opponent guessing. Practice common endgames deriving from your opening. Each opening has typical pawn structures and piece imbalances that commonly transpose into the endgame. By practicing common endgames that arrive from specific openings, you're going to be much more confident in the endgame when the queen and the major pieces are traded off the board. For example, the exchange Caro-Kann often leads to pawn structures where white has a strong pawn majority on the queen side. You can practice how to play these positions when some pieces are traded off the board. For example, if you're unfamiliar with how black uses a minority attack in this Carlsbad structure, it might be wise to practice it. Another example in the Caro-Kann is the Panov attack, where white will end up with a single isolated queen pawn. We know with the black pieces you should try to be forcing white to keep this weakness on the board so we can try to win it ourselves. But we should also be practicing how we can be winning this pawn in the endgames should we successfully achieve our opening goals. Being prepared for the endgames that arise from your opening gives you a major advantage against players that solely rely on their middle game tactics. It ensures that your preparation is absolutely complete from your first move to your last. I highly recommend you play out some common endgames you get in your positions against an engine, or you can study general endgames on chess.com or Lichess. To highlight my success with these opening tips, I want to end today's video off with a game that I played quite recently on chess.com. Whilst we walk through, I'll refer back to a few things that we've talked about today and how it influenced this game. So let's get into that game. So this is the game that we're going to be looking at to end off the video, and in the comments below, see if you can find all of the tips that are demonstrated within this game. We've actually looked at this position once before in this game, but this is something that really happened, and it happened because I followed the advice in this video, and it's something I really wish I learned a lot sooner. So we get the move d4, and then we reply with d5, and we get the Queen's Gambit immediately, and you can play c5 a lot later, and it's called the Tarrasch defense. There's also the pseudo Tarrasch defense, but playing it on move 2, I actually saw Hikaru Nakamura play this quite a bit. This is called the Queen's Gambit declined Austrian variation. A very weird opening. It's not the best for the black pieces, but I find that the only thing that the engine really likes against the Queen's Gambit is declining it with e6, which I just don't really want to play into. There's a lot of theory there, and I think that the Austrian variation gets great positions for black, if I'm being completely honest, and it's something that white very often doesn't know the theory for. And in this case, my opponent didn't really know the theory. They continue with a theoretical move with c takes d5, but after queen takes d5, they play knight c3, already an inaccuracy. And maybe knight c3 is kind of a common enough response that you would probably study that and it's already also very obvious that queen takes d4 is going to be the best move. But after takes, and knight b5, you've got two moves. And this is probably where your study ends. Your study probably ends at, you know that knight a6 is a good move, you know that king d8 is a good move. And, I mean, logically, you're going to play knight a6. It feels like just the more natural, more human move to be playing. King d8, I've actually explored this a little bit. Very annoying to play with the black pieces. The engine thinks it's fine. I don't. But if your theory ended on this move before you could play knight a6 was the last move you looked at, you wouldn't know that taking the pawn very naturally is losing. It's losing by negative 0.5. So not very much, but it's important that we understand how to capitalize on this. The best move, of course, we looked at this in the video, was to play knight f3, because there's simply no way that we can play e4, because then they'll take this pawn. So they have to play knight f3, but if they do take, we immediately take the center with e5. And again, we looked at this, so I'll continue. The best move here is to play knight b5. I'm actually not entirely sure what the best move is here. It's just to play knight d7, and maybe we want to castle long here. Very, very tricky ideas with the Austrian, if the opponent doesn't know the theory. But they play the wrong move. They do not play knight b5. Of course, knight b5 is, for example, if we want to play this knight b4 move now, they've got this check threat of their own. They're threatening to fork us, so we can't really do that. We have to address the threat first, or keep this knight kind of tied down to the square. We can't also kick out the knight because our h-pawn is blocked in. So we'll go back. My opponent instead plays this move, and now there is no impending threat on the c7 square, so we can go ahead and play knight b4. And again, we've already looked at this. King d1, again, is the best move, which my opponent plays, but I still knew the theory. I still, okay, we can count how many bad moves my opponent has made up until this point. So obviously this is all theory. One inaccuracy there. We take, Knight b5, knight a6, another inaccuracy. I'm still in theory. 2 inaccuracies and I'm still in theory. We go e5, another mistake and I'm still in theory. Because I play knight b4, king d1, I'm still in theory, bishop e6 is the best move. I'm still in theory. There's been 3 mistakes in this game and I'm still in theory because I studied the bad theory. We can continue, of course. If you take here, I'm going to castle with check. This is very, very dangerous for white to be doing. They instead play e4, which doesn't stop anything, actually. It gets the bishop open, sure, but it doesn't really stop anything. I castle, of course. I think that rook d8 check is probably also fine, but castling is obviously a little bit better. My opponent plays king e2, and it's mate. This would never happen if you played something very simple, a very simple King's Indian. You're never going to win in, how many moves with this? 12 moves in the King's Indian. But it's check and checkmate. Knight c2, checkmate in 12 moves. All because I studied bad theory. I looked at one principle that we looked at in this video, and it resulted in me beating one of the most common openings in chess in 12 moves. And that's all the tips I have for you guys today regarding openings for advanced players. I hope you all enjoyed, but as I said, I could have gone on about a lot more things in this video, but I didn't want to be stating the obvious and all of these opening principles that are already so prevalent on YouTube. The next video you see on this channel will most likely be the round 1 recap for the World Chess Championship between Gukesh and Ding. But apart from that video, let me know in the comments below what else you'd like to see on this channel. As I said, I hope you all enjoyed today's video, and as always, I will see you all in the next one.